He made free use of Christian vocabulary. He talked about the blessing of the Almighty and the Christian confessions which would become the pillars of his new government. He assumed the earnestness of a man weighed down by historic responsibility. He handed out pious stories to the press, especially to the church papers. He showed his tattered Bible and declared that he drew the strength for his great work from it, as scores of pious people welcomed him as a man sent from God. Adolf Hitler was a master of outward religiosity with no inward reality. Hypocrisy is not a new phenomenon. It may be more public today than it ever has been, simply because of our information age, the news cycle, and things of that sort. But hypocrisy itself is not new. It is as old as this world itself. And if we had time to survey the Bible as a whole, we could point out countless examples of hypocrisy even among the people of God. For instance, you consider the reason in Genesis 3 that Adam and Eve hid from God when they heard Him walking in the midst of the garden in the cool of the day. They recognized their hypocrisy and attempted to hide themselves from Him. Genesis 3 and verse 8. Abraham, the father of the Israelite nation, one of the great men of faith in all the Bible. At least twice in the Bible we find in Genesis 12 and Genesis 20 him committing an act of hypocrisy in instructing his wife Sarah to lie about their relationship. Abraham's hypocrisy not only affected him and his life, but also seemed to be a motivating factor in a similar instance with his son Isaac. Genesis 26, 6 through 9. The hypocrisy continued through that genealogical line as Jacob, the son of Isaac and Rebekah, committed an act of hypocrisy both against his father and against his brother. Genesis 27. Later on, one of his sons, Joseph, had his brothers conspire against him in a fit of hypocritical rage. Genesis 37, verse 18 and following. And then when you enter into the book of Exodus and the remainder of the historical books of the Old Testament, you find that family through the nation of Israel continuing to commit acts of hypocrisy throughout their history, plaguing them in their relationship with God. And much of the problems they face throughout their history can in some way be traced back to acts of hypocrisy. It's for all of that and much more that I believe when we come to James 1 and verse 8. And we find a particular warning that James levied against such hypocrisy. It's not a random, arbitrary statement, but rather one that was made by inspiration upon years and years and years of observation of the human race. When he simply recorded these words, "A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways." That, friends, is a universal truth. Double-mindedness in any arena of life is going to result in that ultimate instability. because that double-mindedness is a reference to hypocrisy. In Numbers 22, though, we are introduced to a man who was about as double-minded as anybody throughout human history. And it is his story that teaches us so much about the need that we have for consistency in our lives, lest we begin to resemble such a two-faced man. You're familiar with the name Balaam. And this morning I want us to take a brief trek through Numbers 22 and following regarding inspiration's story of a two-faced man. We begin this morning in Numbers chapter 22 by looking at the biography of this two-faced man, because in Numbers 22 we find essentially three facts about Balaam's life. Number one, it is said of Balaam that he was a diviner or a diviner, a medium, so to speak. He was looked upon as a prophet. Number two, Balaam is referred to as the son of Beor. And number three, it is said of Balaam that he was from the town of Pethor. Now, essentially, that is all that Numbers 22 reveals to us about Balaam's biographical history. Now, it is true that we find other instances throughout the Scriptures, both the Old and the New Testament, where Balaam is mentioned. And so we are then therefore able to draw more information about him from those passages. For instance, in Deuteronomy 23 and verse 4, we find that Balaam was a native of Mesopotamia. And the land of Mesopotamia was simply that land that dwelt between the rivers, as is indicative of the word Mesopotamia, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. And this, of course, was the same area of land where Abraham had dwelt temporarily, as was mentioned in Acts 7 and verse 2. But I find that significant for this reason. Although Balaam was a Gentile, a man of a heathen nation, he apparently still had a vast knowledge of the true God and could speak intelligently about God. Just like Abraham, though he came from a far country and dwelt in this very same region, knew about Jehovah God of heaven. So did Balaam. And thus, as Balaam functioned in his role as a prophet, 2 Peter 2:15 and 16, it's apparent that he had in some way the capability to communicate with God, even as Balak recognized Numbers 22 and verse 8. Now, with all of that in mind, I want to stop and ponder this point for just a second. It is assumed that an individual who functions in the role of a prophet of Jehovah, is going to in some way be able to maintain a civil and righteous relationship with the God of heaven for this reason. How else were prophets designated or identified in Scripture? Well, they were referred to as seers, but they were referred to likewise by this designation. Prophets were oftentimes called men of God. Now, you go through and you examine the prophetic books, Isaiah through Malachi, and see how God would address these prophets from time to time, and tell me if I'm wrong. God would call these individuals men of God, which I believe carries with it a particular connotation. That being that it is simply assumed that a prophet, a man of God in that sense, would be a faithful and steadfast servant of the God of heaven. That there would be no aught between them and God, but rather that their relationship would be stable. and that it would be good and fruitful in their lives. But with that in mind, it's also necessary to point out that prophets were men. They were human beings. Now, they might have been extraordinary human beings, but they were human beings nonetheless. They were prone to the same weaknesses and temptations and trials that any man or woman would face in life. And so even though we might simply assume that a prophet would automatically have a proper relationship with the God of heaven, we find that because of their human state, it simply was not necessarily the case. And that is important as we begin to delve into a study of the life of Balaam. He was a prophet, but his relationship with God simply was not what it should have been. As a prophet, Balaam was obviously well known enough that he was specifically selected by the mighty Moabite king Balak to carry out somewhat of a dastardly scheme that he had in mind. And that's where the story picks up in Numbers chapter 22. Because in Numbers 22, the nation of Israel had encamped outside of Moab. If you go back to Numbers 21, you'll find the record of which Israel came up against the Amorites and just utterly destroyed them. Well, that was because they trusted in God, and God had promised them, if you will trust in me, if you will believe me, if you will serve me, I will go before you into battle, and I will fight for you, and we will gain the victory. Well, Israel did that. And so when in Numbers 21 they came up against the Amorite nation, they were victorious. And it was such a wonderful victory. But word of that spread quickly. And so we come to Numbers 22, and Balak, who was the king of Moab, which was the land just east of the Jordan River, heard of that great victory. And he was afraid. Because he understood that if Israel could destroy the Amorites, they had the potential to destroy Moab. Could they defeat them militarily? He didn't believe so. So therefore, the only thing that he thought could happen to aid them in defending themselves against this powerful nation was to call for a prophet, someone with whom God conversed, and had that prophet in their authority curse the nation of Israel. And in cursing the nation of Israel, then weaken them to such an extent that Moab would be able to win. Who did Balak turn to as the prophet of his choice? He turned to a native of Mesopotamia named Balaam. And in Numbers 22, Balak sent to Balaam, he sent messengers. He told him what he wanted done. And to Balaam's credit, Balaam began somewhat of a process that took place in the next 3 chapters through chapter 24, in which he would go back and forth. Now that wasn't to his credit, but this was to his credit. When those messengers came to Balaam at the beginning, his first response was to go to God. Now that's somewhat of a biography of Balaam's life. You go beginning in Numbers 22 and work your way through the first few verses, and what we find is that Balaam is somewhat of a precarious situation for this reason. Balaam is a prophet of God, therefore one who is intended to be a servant of God, but now he has a very powerful and ruthless king who is asking him to do something that he knows God would not approve of. What's Balaam going to do? I wish we could stop here and say that, well, Balaam was a prophet of God. Therefore, he was a man of God. Therefore, he knew what the proper reaction would be. And he did it without question and without reservation. The sad part is that we have to now move in our study from discussing this biography of a two-faced man to looking at the bargain of the two-faced man. Because when those messengers arrived at Balaam's home, the pandering began. Now, as we said before, immediately after Balaam was approached by these messengers, he went to God. And what a marvelous attitude that is first displayed by this individual. Because by this first response, it is assumed that his primary concern in this whole transaction is to do whatever he did in word or in deed by the authority of God, Colossians 3 and verse 17. And God's response was very, very clear. Balaam says, God, what shall I do? And his response in verse 12 is this: Thou shalt not go with them. Thou shalt not curse the people, for they are blessed. Now, at Numbers 22 and verse 12, I can say with all confidence, the matter should have been closed. God has issued His will. He has issued His expectation. And so therefore, for all intents and purposes, in the mind of a true believer and servant of God, the matter is settled. He has said, Thou shalt not curse the people. Thou shalt not go with the messengers. And if Balaam had truly been the man of God that he was supposed to have been, that would have settled it. End of the story. However, Balaam went back to these messengers, told them what the will of God was. And after telling Balak, the Moabite king, that Balaam refused to come, Balaam sent back word in verse 16 and following, because he was not just going to be easily rejected. This is a king of a powerful nation. He was used to having his way. And he might have to do a little bit of bargaining, but he had every confidence in the world that he would get the yes. And so in verse 16, he sent back word saying, Let nothing, I pray thee, hinder thee from coming unto me. For I will promote thee unto a very great honor, and I will do whatsoever thou sayest unto me. Come therefore, I pray thee, and curse me this people. It's not to be surprising that Balak would continue to pursue Balaam in this sense. What should be surprising to us is that Balaam did not stick to the will of God. Because Balaam responded and said yes, that he would do nothing that God prohibited from, regardless of what the reward might be but. Read with me Numbers 22 and verse 19. Because as I said a minute ago, in verse 12, when God first said, Thou shalt not go, thou shalt not curse the people, the matter should have been settled. And again, to Balaam's credit, he stuck to his guns the second time and said, I'm not going to do anything that God will not permit me to do. But, verse 19, Now therefore I pray you, tarry ye also here this night, that I may know what the Lord will say unto me more. Parents, have you ever had one of your children come to you, mother or father, and ask you, can I have this? Can I do this? Can I go there? And for whatever reason, your answer is no. What is your assumption, and justified assumption at that, when you tell your child or children no? It is your justified assumption that the matter is now settled. Now, reality dictates that it's probably not, but your assumption should be the matter is settled. As a parent, I have issued my authority. I've told them no, that's it. But sometimes when you did that or are doing it now, what happens? What do children sometimes like to do? They like to go to the other parent and see if they can't get a different response. Or they may come back to the same parent and change the terms or do some kind of bargaining and hope to get a different response. But you know, for all intents and purposes, the matter should have been settled. What's Balaam doing in verse 19? Now, yes, I know he has said, I'm not going to do anything the Lord has told me not to do, but let me just ask him one more time. Let me make sure he hasn't changed his mind on the matter. Let me make sure that what he told me yesterday or 2 or 3 days ago, whenever it was, is still the same thing he wants me to do today. You know, while there is much to be said for Balaam's initial responses to the inquiry of these messengers, I have to, in verse 19, come to the conclusion that in Balaam's heart of hearts, at the very core of his being, there is something within him that wants to go. There's something within him that wants the honor that's going to be bestowed upon him by Balak. There is something within him that wants him to have an audience with a mighty king of this capacity. There is something within him who wants to be able to go to him and request of him anything that he wants and it be granted. And so he says, let me ask just one more time. And so he does. And God comes to him again and tells him, if these messengers come to you again, go with them. Now, he doesn't give him permission to curse the people, but he did say, if in the morning the messengers come and call upon you, then you can go. But we gain further insight into the hypocrisy of Balaam when in the morning, without being approached by those messengers again, what does he do? Verse 21. Balaam rose up in the morning and saddled his donkey, and he went with the princes of Moab. Did he wait for them to come and call on him? No. Now you might say, well, how can you know that? How can you know that they didn't come and call and then he went? Because after all, that's what God told him to do. I know that because of what we find in verse 22. Because in verse 22 we find the anger of the Lord being kindled against Balaam because he went. God had only given him permission to go if they had come to call. But he went and God was angry with him, which can only allow us to conclude that they did not come and call on him. He went of his own accord, which goes back to our original premise that there was something within him that made him want to go. And so he is continually in this bargaining process. And of course, the remainder of Numbers 22 records the instance in which he is traveling with a donkey and they are confronted by the angel and the donkey speaks and all of that. But for our purposes, what we find is the case. Balaam is bargaining between God and man. And that will not work ever. Because the result that we will have in our lives if we attempt to do that is going to be the same that occurred in the life of Balaam. The anger of the Lord shall be kindled against us. How ultimately was this going to play out? We know a little bit about Balaam's life. We've seen the process with which Balaam has approached this whole transaction. But the funny thing about a two-faced man is this. He will betray you every time. Now, who is the you that he's going to betray? Everybody with whom he is in contact. The funny thing about a two-faced individual, a hypocrite, is this. They spend all of their time trying to satisfy everybody, all the while nobody is satisfied. And that's exactly what happens with Balaam. Yes, he's put a good face on trying to be pleasing to God by saying, well, I'm not going to do anything that God doesn't want me to do. That sounds pretty good. And that's a good attitude to have. And so he thought he was being pleasing to God by expressing that attitude. But at the same time, he is still pandering to Balak by saying, well, let me go and see what God has to say again. And then in Numbers 23 and 24, he actually got to Moab. And he went through 3 different instances trying to get an answer from God that might be different. Why? He's pandering, and at the end of the day, what happened? Neither one of them were happy. God wasn't happy with them. Balak wasn't happy with them. Balaam had spent all his time trying to satisfy both, and at the end of the day, neither one were. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus stated this very principle. Because he in fact said that what Balaam was trying to do in Numbers 22 through 24 was an absolute impossibility. You remember the words of Jesus, no man can serve 2 masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. What had Balaam been trying to do through this whole process? He had been trying to a degree to serve God, but at the same time, he was earnestly seeking after the rewards of a prosperous heathen king. And friends, it will never work. And the conclusion of any hypocrite, any two-faced individual, is ultimately going to be the same as was the conclusion of this whole ordeal for Balaam. The anger of the Lord will be kindled against us, just as it was against him. In many ways, wasn't that the very same problem that plagued the church at Laodicea? Revelation chapter 3 and verse 16, John had to declare the words of Jesus, that because ye are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I will spew thee out of my mouth. And that's the very reason why in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 12, Peter provides for us somewhat of a summary conclusion to the type of influence that Balaam left upon the world because of his actions. Turn to 2 Peter 2 and read with me verses 12 through 17. And let's see what the inspired reaction to Balaam's attitude and acts truly was. 2 Peter 2, beginning in verse 12. But these, as natural brute beasts, made to be taken and destroyed, speak evil of the things that they understand not, and shall utterly perish in their own corruption, and shall receive the reward of unrighteousness, as they that count it a pleasure to ride in the daytime. Spots they are and blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings while they feast with you, having eyes full of adultery and that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls and heart they have exercised with covetous practices, cursed children, which have forsaken the right way and are gone astray, following after what way? Now what Peter is doing here is discussing the current state and the future of heretics, false teachers, unrighteous individuals. And he's kind of summing up who these people really are at their very core. And he says at their core, verse number 15, they have forsaken the right way, they have gone astray and followed the way of Balaam, the son of Bozor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness, but was rebuked for his iniquity. The dumb donkey, speaking with man's voice, forbade the madness of the prophet. And I love the way verse 17 sums up the quality of these individuals. He says that they are wells without water, clouds that are carried with a tempest, to whom the mist of darkness is reserved forever. You want to know the tale of a two-faced man? All you have to do is read about the life of men like Balaam. And then see what the divine response to such a life lived truly is. These are the words of God Himself. Balaam forsook the right ways and was gone astray, because he loved the wages of unrighteousness. And because of that was as a well without water, dried up and useless. Friends, that story is not isolated in the life of Balaam. That's a story that has played out time and time again for ages. It's a story that played out countless times throughout the biblical narrative. And it is a story that continues to be lived out day after day after day. The tale of two-faced men. Those who on the outside seek to please God, but otherwise are seeking after those wages of unrighteousness. Seeking to serve both God and mammon. A physical impossibility that ultimately is going to result, as it did with the Laodiceans, being neither hot nor cold, but being spewed out of the mouth of God. Friend, don't let that be your tale this morning. Don't let that be the story of your life. Make the decision in a most definitive manner this morning. I'm going to serve God. And when God tells me what His will is, that settles the matter. There's no question. There's no hesitancy. But I will do what my God has told me to do, and that will be it, and that will be enough. Would you do that this morning if you have not already? Believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, repenting of your sin, confessing that faith publicly, and being immersed in water to have your sins washed away. If you'd be willing to do that, then we plead with you to do it today before it's everlastingly too late. To make your life right before God by making that decision to stand on the Lord's side. Or maybe you've done that in the past, but since time you've gone back into the ways of the world, you're not living faithfully any longer, consistency has forsaken you, and now you're no better than Balaam, or those like Balaam. Why not make the decision this morning to change, to put all of that behind you, and to be as good as God can make you, which is complete and whole and right. Repent of those sins. Confess them and pray unto God for forgiveness, and He will forgive you. Cleanse you of all of your unrighteousness, and remember your sins and your iniquities no more. If you're subject to that invitation, the invitation of Jesus, would you come and make your life right today? before it's everlastingly too late. Do it now, while together we stand and sing.